Hello and welcome back to our whistle-stop tour of migration, our topic for AQA History GCSE. So we looked at Migration Unit 1 in our first video. If you haven't already, then please do go back and have a look at that. And in our Migration Unit 1 topic, we were mainly looking at how England and the idea of England was formed as a country. So we covered a lot about the Vikings, and we looked at how England became part of initial empires. So things like the North Sea Empire with King Canute, and then also the Angevin Empire, which included parts of France. So we looked at that in our Unit 1. And now we need to be focusing on Unit 2, which is mainly looking at England and Britain's relationship with America. It's mainly about how Britain started to look west. So let's kick us off then, because there's quite a lot to cover in this unit. We're going to start off by looking at America, privateers and the slave trade. So the first European to go to America was in 1492, the Portuguese explorer Christopher Columbus. And I say he discovered America because, as we know, there were already indigenous or native people there. And it was the start of Europeans travelling over in order mainly for economic resources. Britain started to send privateers over, so they were pirates who were given permission by the king or queen to steal from other countries' boats and to steal materials to bring back to Britain. And one of the key people that you could get asked about is this man on the top right. His name is John Hawkins, and he in 1562 was the first British man who became involved in the slave trade, hence his nickname, the father of the slave trade. And he was a business partner of Queen Elizabeth I. He was a ship owner who was given responsibility to capture enslaved people. And it was the start of British involvement in slavery that would last from 1562 all the way up to 1833. And hopefully you've seen this triangular slave trade picture as the slave trade develops. The easiest way of sort of thinking about it is that Britain takes over developed goods that they've made in their factories, particularly during the Industrial Revolution from 1750 onwards, that they take those via boat down to West Africa, where they trade them for enslaved people. Those enslaved people are then taken on this journey here, what is called the Middle Passage, often in terrible conditions, and they are traded and dropped off in the Americas, so in the Caribbean or in parts of America, as we know today, where they would work on plantations. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the stuff that they produce, the things that are made on the plantations, that are farmed, things like cotton and tobacco, they are then shipped back to Britain to be turned into developed goods again. So, for instance, the sugar may be turned into things like alcohol, rum. So that is the start of Britain's involvement in slavery. And Britain made millions of pounds from the slave trade over those centuries. Our approximate figure is 600 million, and buildings in port cities where the materials were brought back to in Britain, so places like Liverpool, they became incredibly wealthy. You could say that places like Liverpool Town Hall are built with the profits from slavery, and that's something that we as a country are still wrestling with, our legacy of what we do about our involvement in slave trade. So Britain didn't, although it started off by trading and setting up plantations, British people started to settle in America, which will eventually lead to American independence. So in 1620, on the ship that is sort of depicted on our top right, a group of strict Protestants went on a ship called the Mayflower for Massachusetts in North America. And they did so, their main motivation was because they wanted to have a home with complete religious freedom. They were Puritans, which were a very, very strict form of Protestants, and they didn't feel, even though Britain was a Protestant country at that time, they did not feel like they were welcome and able to live their life with the freedom they wanted. So when they got there, they had help from local indigenous tribes, the native people, and they settled and became the first Americans. They are also known as the Pilgrim Fathers, and in America, in November of each year, they are celebrated with the festival of Thanksgiving. Another colony that was set up, when I say colony, I mean an area of land that's taken over by another country. Another area was Jamestown in Virginia, and for that one we are looking at our second picture underneath, Walter Raleigh. So he was a sea captain for Queen Elizabeth I and then her successor King James I, and he established the colony of Jamestown, named after the king, in the state of Virginia, which is named after Elizabeth the Virgin Queen. And Jamestown was mainly built, unlike Massachusetts, which was for religious reasons, it was mainly built for economic reasons. They set up huge plantations of tobacco and cotton, which are sometimes called cash crops, and they were usually farmed by enslaved people. Once Britain starts to play an active part in the slave trade, then those plantations are farmed by enslaved people. Raleigh, you might also have heard of him in your studies because he's credited with bringing the potato to Europe. So if that is a question you may have seen about the significance of Walter Raleigh, you could think about why he was significant in his own lifetime for your first paragraph, and then in the long term, the impact that bringing back tobacco and potatoes has had on British society. And in terms of how the natives were impacted by these colonists. In Massachusetts, part of the reason they celebrate Thanksgiving is because they are wanting to recognise the fact that they were helped by the native tribes. But over time, there was a devastating effect on those indigenous people. So in 1500, there were over 500,000 Native Americans in British territories, areas that had been colonised by British groups. But within 200 years, this number had halved to 280,000, with many of them killed by European diseases like measles, like smallpox, that the natives had never come across before. Their immune systems were not prepared for. So now we get into thinking about American independence. So from our top right picture, we can see the Boston Tea Party. So that is a 1773 event where colonists, so people who had moved away from Britain and were established in America, they felt upset that Britain was increasing taxes. So when Britain put a tax on tea, they decided that they were going to rebel and protest. The colonists were already upset because of high levels of tax, so things like the Navigation Acts, having to pay money to Britain every time they were doing any trade deals, and they also felt like they'd been forgotten by Britain. They had this slogan of no taxation without representation. Why would we pay you taxes, they're arguing, if you're not going to represent our views, not going to try and help our lives by discussing us in Parliament? So in protest, Americans dumped 342 crates of tea worth £10,000 into the sea at Boston Harbour, and that is the spark event. There's loads of things building up, loads of sort of economic grievances or feel like they're being treated unfairly, bubbling up over time, but the spark event is the Boston Tea Party, and that is the start of the War of Independence against Britain. And the War of Independence, it lasts for 8 years, but America declares its independence from Britain in 1776, and that is the year that they celebrate their independence from Britain from. The leader of their army is pictured on our right hand side. It's George Washington. He became the first president of the USA, and the war, although it was a devastating blow for Britain to lose America, and they were embarrassed that they'd lost to a group of people that they didn't think of as a fighting unit, a fighting machine compared to the might of the British Empire. In the long run, you could argue that it helped Britain out. The war did cost Britain $80 million, but that was a bit of a drop in the ocean for Britain at this time. It was incredibly wealthy. It was the start of the Industrial Revolution, so Britain is absolutely flying economically, and the USA really quickly became one of Britain's key trading partners. Another key thing that happens because of American independence, and this will come into play more with Unit 3, is that Britain's focus shifts from America completely to India, and India becomes what they call the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So a couple of groups to discuss then before we think about some practice questions. The Huguenots are one that are a particularly interesting group who come to Britain, and they could be classed, there's an argument to say they're the first refugees that come to Britain, and they mainly come for religious reasons. In 1572, 70,000 Protestants are killed in France, which is a Catholic country, in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And that bubbles up over time, and their rights are taken away. They are felt that they are being persecuted for being Protestant. And so by 1650, 50,000 Huguenots, which is the name for French Protestants, start to arrive in Britain. And what is so important about that is that the Huguenots were skilled craftsmen who brought industries like watchmaking and the paper industry, which led to them introducing paper money into Britain, which absolutely revolutionised the British economy at that time. The Huguenots merged into English society. So in a way that sometimes migrant groups are criticised for, the Huguenots really merged themselves in. So they changed their names from Monsieur Blanc into Mr. White, and they became a key part of British society. We've already talked about the things that they brought, like watchmaking, paper money, but we've also got key people who are of Huguenot descent, and those people include the man pictured on your bottom right underneath the depiction of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. You've got Winston Churchill. Now, Churchill is voted the greatest Briton of all time in leading Britain during World War II. You could argue, if you get a question about the significance of the Huguenots, you could not only talk in the short term about the economic impact, but you could talk about that long-term impact, that our greatest ever Britain wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Huguenot migration. Final one then is two put together really. It's the Ulster plantation, so affecting what we now know as Northern Ireland, and the Highland clearances in Scotland. The Ulster plantations were when King James I in the 1600s, he planted, sort of sent to live, a group of loyal Protestants to go and live in the area known as Ulster in the north of Ireland. And he did that because the country of Ireland was Catholic, and he wanted to influence them to support him as a king more, but also to be more Protestant. And this is such a significant moment because Ulster separates and becomes Northern Ireland. So now we have Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as separate countries, with the Northern Ireland mainly being Protestant and the Republic of Ireland mainly being Catholic. And then the Highland clearances, which are from 1750 to 1860, and you can see there's a picture there of sort of the desperation that came from the Highland clearances. And that is when the English brutally removed people in the Highlands who were against the king. A lot of the people in the Highlands were called Jacobites because they wanted a different royal family in charge. So the English responded to this by killing clan chiefs, because in the Highlands many were living in very sort of tribal type situations, living in clans and having chiefs, and they also made land much more expensive, which forced the people of the Highlands to spread out, not just to other parts of Scotland, to southern parts of Scotland, but also across the world. And it created this huge, is one of our fancy words for this topic, created this huge diaspora, when people who start in a certain place then spread out across the world. So, if you want to practice some questions from this unit, then these are some practice questions you could have a go at. And they are question 2 and question 4 of this topic. Remember, there's only 4 questions in total. And if you do all of these videos, we will practice each of those different ones. So question 2 is a comparison question. It says, compare the Vikings with British colonists in America. How are they similar? So you've got 2 groups there. If you've got to do 2 paragraphs because it's an 8 marker, you could think about, firstly, why did they come to Britain? So you might look for a similarity there and you go, okay, the Vikings came over because they wanted to steal from the monasteries. So there's an economic reason. And then the British colonists in America, Pilgrim Fathers, maybe that's more religious, so that doesn't fit. But you could talk about Jamestown and Walter Raleigh. You could say that they both came for economic reasons. And then you could talk about what impact they had as your second paragraph. So think about the Vikings changing culture, you could think about setting up of the Danelaw and things like that, and compare that with the British colonists leading to the American War of Independence. The fact that they had a devastating effect on the Native Americans in America. You could compare that with how the Vikings attacked and raided parts of Britain. So try and find those similarities. If you can find 2, then you'll build up a brilliant 8-mark answer. And then finally, our big factor question, which it's good to keep thinking about how you would answer it, is choose as one of our 7 factors. It says, have science and technology been the main reason for migration to and from Britain? And that's a really tricky one, but think about what would fit in with that. So you could argue, for instance, you could argue about the longboat for Vikings maybe. If you're wanting to use more stuff from this era, you could think about how the printing press is influencing people to try and spread their ideas. Maybe that's part of the reason that people go to America. And try and cover as many different time frames as you can. In an ideal answer, in your 3 paragraphs and a conclusion, which would be perfect, you would cover 3 different time frames. So think about what you can take from this one. And remember, only one of your paragraphs is on science and technology. So you could be thinking about, from this one, you could go, however, another reason was economic reasons, and tell me all about things like Jamestown, or do religion and tell me all about the Pilgrim Fathers. Okay, I hope that is helpful for you. I'll be back very soon with our Unit 3 video, and best of luck with your revision. Bye-bye.